Good afternoon. I'm glad we're starting the second half of our day with this discussion. Our session is called Taxing the Super Rich to Finance SDGs, Climate Action and Addressing Inequality. Let's just take a look at that. When we're talking about, these are the big challenges humanity faces at the moment, right? And we know that there are huge financing gaps when it comes to addressing these challenges. So I know the estimates differ, so don't nail me down on $1 trillion or two here. But the financing gap for the SDGs is estimated to be between 2.5 and 4 trillion US dollars annually. And the finance gap for addressing climate change is estimated around 7 trillion US dollars annually. Now, I don't know about you, me personally, when it comes into the trillions, it becomes completely abstract. So I like the comparison just to sort of get back at what kind of amounts we're talking about here. If we take it down to seconds, 1 billion seconds is around just under 32 years. So I remember what I did 32 years ago. I'm sorry, I am that old. And 1 trillion seconds is 32,000 years ago. That was the Ice Age. We had mammoth and sable-toothed tigers roaming the earth. So those are the kinds of amounts we're talking about here. So why are we talking about taxing the super rich to finance for these challenges? It's a bit old. It's a 2023 estimate, which comes from UBS. And for those that don't know UBS is one of the biggest private banks of Switzerland, so not known as a hotbed of socialism or communism. Their estimate of the wealth of the richest 1% of the world was 240 trillion US dollars. That's 47.5% of global wealth. So they have 214 trillion US dollars wealth, and we need $7 trillion annually to address the climate financing gap, or 4 trillion to address the SDG gap. And this also not only against the background that a large part of that wealth was accumulated in exploitation and in historical injustices, but also that these super rich continue to contribute disproportionately to climate change with their carbon emissions. So the size of the challenge is there. And we also know that at the moment they are not contributing their fair share because it's the super rich who hardly pay taxes. It's us, the workers, who pay the taxes, but they are able to minimize their income taxes and use the loopholes and pay only the equivalent of around 0.5% of their wealth in personal tax. So, we have an exacerbation of this gap and of this inequality. Last year, under the Brazilian presidency, the G20 committed to ensure the taxation of the super rich, and several countries are now considering introducing measures to collect more revenues from them. And this is what we want to focus in on in this session. What are the outlooks for there? What is the relevance of that for the African continent, but also for South Africa, which, as we've discussed at several points today, is also one of the most unequal countries of the world. And we're going to do it a little bit differently with this panel, because we're going to start off with a video contribution. We have a small video message from Professor Gabriel Zuckman, who's a professor of economics in Paris at the Paris School of Economics, the École Normale Supérieure, and also in his summers he teaches at the University of California in Berkeley. And he is a commissioner of ICRIT, our partner here, as well as the founding director of the EU Tax Observatory. And he unfortunately couldn't join us today, but I understand he's recorded a small video message to get us kick-started in this discussion. And can I ask our technicians to... No, I can't ask our technicians. Do I have a chance of seeing it later? Should I just wait, or is it not going to be possible? You have the video. Yeah? Can we see it? Ah, you don't have it. Ah, does anyone know where the video is? Okay. Then I think we're just going to get started with our discussions, so we don't lose time because we're already a little bit behind time. So let me come to the real people in the room, the people who are here. On my panel, I have Anne Wanyagati-Minor, who works for the South Center as a research consultant in tax. Anne is a tax expert who's been working on these issues for over a decade, working on tax policy, administration, and international tax reforms. And is now in Geneva. For those of you that don't know, the South Center, it's an organization that supports developing countries in negotiations at the international organizations in Geneva, and Anne especially supports developing countries in the negotiations at the UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation. Then next to her we have Susana Ruiz from Oxfam. Susana has a background in international business and international relationships in France and Spain, but she also worked in China for 7 years. Before then joining Oxfam in Spain and focusing there on public financing and the role of the private sector, leading the tax justice campaign for Oxfam in Latin America and writing several reports around these issues for Oxfam. And then next to her we have Tanya. Tanya van Melis is the head of policy at COSATU, the South African Trade Union Confederation. And she has worked with the trade union movement for over 10 years, but she's also had stints on the government side of things, working on economic development, trade, industry, and competition as well. And finally, I don't think there's anyone in the room who hasn't met him yet, Zimbali, because he's been keeping us on schedule. Zimbani Mkube is the budget and tax policy researcher of the IEJ. He is a social justice activist and researcher who has experience working with a range of civil society organizations. He used to be a steering committee member of the Budget Justice Coalition and now leads the work on budget and tax policy at the IEJ. All right, so let's dig into these issues. And Susanna told me at the beginning I shouldn't start with her, but I hope you will forgive me if I do anyway. I mean, we've been discussing today about the global initiatives, and of course a global solution is our ultimate goal. That is what we are fighting for. But then we can't do nothing until we get there. So how do we build on that? And while we're building the necessary political momentum for this agenda to become reality, what can individual countries do to advance measures taxing the super rich?
Thanks very much, Axa, for having me and for listening to my petitions. So first I want to say that when a country moves into tax reform, it's a political decision. So we have to create the conditions for those political reforms. One of the conditions is where the public opinion is. So most of the time, and it's been said this morning, the difficulties in getting reforms passed is not the technical element, but it's the political context, the power context sometimes, most of the time. So when we are working on those discussions at the global level, part of what we are doing is to creating the environment to change the political understanding of why a process, a tax reform is feasible, and also for a country to say, I'm not alone in going into this direction. So even if it's sometimes the global discussion is the beginning of creating the conditions, the environment for the minds to be changed in a way that it creates the change in the mindset at home. So what we need to be doing is a combination of global, regional, and domestic reforms. And of course, the real change will happen when it's happening at the domestic level. But very often the domestic level takes longer to, or sometimes it's not so far away in the process, in the reforms, unless we have the environment at the international level. So don't underestimate how helpful it is, something that is happening, well, the G20 this year in South Africa, in the country, but sometimes we see the G20 very far away from home, or very far away from average citizen. But what happens so far away matters a lot for what is the real life for most of citizens. So that's one of the things. I mean, creating the environment for change to be happening at the domestic level. I always remember one of the countries, when we were working on the Pillar 2 solutions, one of the ministers we were talking to, we were asking him, what do you think about the tax reform? And he was saying, I think it's a bad idea. Are you going to support it? He said, yes. Why? Because it's very difficult for a country from the global south to say no to something that is profiled as the deal of the century. So what we need to do as activists is to create the conditions for the deal of the century to be something that is positive for most of the global south country, but for average citizens also. So that's part of our job, to create that. And very often we discuss on the technicalities, but we don't discuss enough on how the perception of those deals are for policymakers, how they can use that in a way that they can explain to their constituency, how they can break the resistance at home in front of the business to say, this is just the right way to go ahead. And I'm sorry that we don't have a Gabriel Zuckman video, but I think he will probably, he's one of those voices who help in making things and being understood by many others, because it makes sense. So that's part of the role we have been doing. Second, countries don't need to be waiting until everything is perfect at the global level to start moving ahead. It might sound as a contradiction, but in fact it's not. So change happens also when we feel the pressure from real reforms happening at the country level. So I come from a country, Spain, where we have a net worth tax implemented for the second time in 2011, in front of it was reintroduced in 2011 in reaction to the financial crisis. So it was introduced by a progressive government and maintained by conservative government because it was necessary, and it was perceived like that, necessary to raise additional revenues to face the kind of, to challenge the financial crisis at that moment in Spain. So, and why it was necessary? Because it's simply where the money is. And it's probably the same reason we have at this moment. We need to be taxing the super rich at this moment because simply it's where the money is at this moment, especially in countries that have been going through multiple crises. So when we're talking about tax reform, maybe we need to think this is a journey also. There are an average battery of solutions that can be implemented in different countries. It's not only the net worth tax, it's taxing capital gains. There are many countries in the continent that still are not taxing the capital gains or that are taxing capital below labor. Why are we taxing capital less or below labor? Or there are many countries in the continent that still don't have an inheritance taxation. So when we're talking about taxing the super rich, think at a battery of taxes. And they are not just a superposition of taxes. They are taxes that will be addressing different moments of wealth creation, wealth concentration, or wealth being transferred. Ute is getting nervous because I'm speaking too much.
No, thank you for that as a very good introduction. I heard we do now have the video. Okay. So I would just quickly jump to that before we continue our discussion. Yes, please go ahead.
Because there's a growing body of evidence that the super rich everywhere pay much less tax than the rest of the population. Their effective tax rate is often only half of what working class people pay, middle class people pay, okay? Concretely, billionaires pay much less tax than their secretaries. And the most powerful way to fix that issue is to say that there should be a floor. If you're extremely rich, you shouldn't be allowed to pay zero or very little. There should be a minimum. then the question becomes, okay, how do we define this minimum? And the answer is easy. The minimum shouldn't be expressed as a fraction of income, because the very notion of income is not well defined for billionaires. They can easily structure their wealth such that their wealth will not generate a lot of income, and that's precisely how they end up paying so little tax today. So for the minimum tax to work, it has to be expressed as a fraction of wealth. Hence the proposal that I developed last year, working closely with the Brazilian presidency of the G20. The proposal is a minimum tax of 2% as a fraction of wealth for centimillionaires, meaning people who have more than $100 million in net wealth. In the report that I wrote for the Brazilian presidency, that was published in June 2024, I detailed this proposal. I explained its feasibility. I explained how we can build on past progress in international cooperation, the automatic exchange of bank information in particular, the global minimum tax on multinational firms, to advance those efforts and now apply that logic to billionaires. We're in a good situation today to make this work. And we don't need a truly global agreement, just like some countries are not implementing the minimum tax on multinational firms. That's okay. This minimum tax works nonetheless, and we can do the same for billionaires. Let me emphasize something that's really important, which is that this standard of taxation, this minimum tax, this floor, is important for all countries. It's not only for rich economies of the North. It's extremely important for the Global South and for African countries and for South Africa in particular. Why? Because in all countries, you have people who have more than $100 million in wealth. Billionaires are relatively few in number, that's true, but everywhere you have lots of people who have tens of millions or 50 million or 100 million or $200 million in wealth. And everywhere those individuals pay very little tax. Okay, so they would be concerned, they would be affected by this 2% minimum tax. And the second thing, and the second reason why this is so important for Global South countries, for African countries, for South Africa in particular, is that it's just not possible to increase taxes on working class and middle class or even upper middle class individuals if the most powerful and the wealthiest individuals in the countries pay very little. Or to put it differently, if you do a genuine effort at better taxing the super rich, those who today pay much less than everybody else, then it opens a realm of possibilities for doing other tax reforms, other tax increases, potentially on broader groups of the population. So to build modern tax systems, progressive tax systems, fair tax systems, we have to start with tackling what is the key issue today, which is the non-taxation of the super rich. This should be the number one priority everywhere. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you for sharing that. A very clear
Today,
call.
no refugees allowed in the
to
United States unless
global
you're
minimum
a white
taxation
South African.
of the super rich.
So to
Tanya,
suddenly hear
let's
that
bring that home.
a country like the
If we're
United
talking about the
States
South
is offering
African
us
context, and it
refugee
came up a
status,
couple of times during our
was a
discussions this morning as well. How do you see the situation here in South Africa? We heard the reasons for being, that speak for taxing wealth and the super rich. When you look at South Africa, what are the consequences of this extreme wealth concentration that you see here? And do you think that taxing the super rich could help build a more equitable economy that works for the majority of the population, that works crucially for workers, and how could that be done?
So thanks for that. Thanks for the question. Thanks for inviting Kasatu to come and speak. I'm not going to go over the statistics for South Africa because we know we are the most unequal country in the world.
What does that mean? Besides looking at it on a social level and a moral level, at an economic level, you cannot have growth in a country where you have extreme inequality. You get one billionaire buying a yacht as opposed to having 10,000 people buying food and clothes for their families for a number of years. So extreme inequality thwarts growth. But I want to move at one step beyond what we've been doing, because we're talking about extreme inequality in terms of people, which is correct, but there's also extreme inequality in terms of companies. So in South Africa, we have very high concentration of wealth. We have monopolies, and by virtue of being monopolies, they stop growth of small and medium enterprises around, whether it's a deliberate action or whether it's just that they're able to capture the market. So that in and of itself stops economic development. It stops more jobs being created. What does it mean for everyday citizens? Well, we know people are confined to working in the informal sector because there aren't jobs. People who don't have proper incomes and are living below the poverty line, over which half the population in South Africa does, are unable to accumulate any wealth at all. In fact, most of them are indebted. The question for me is fundamental. Is it just a question of taking from the rich, giving to the poor, and using tax as a redistribution mechanism? No, it's not. Underlying it is a fundamental transfer of power. It is a fight, and a fight to the bitter end. We've said it's not a technical issue. It's a matter of political will and what people are going to give up their money. So part of the struggle around inequality and taxation is shifting power relations to ordinary people so that we have a say in our everyday lives. We are able to get jobs, create businesses, and engage in economic activity. We are able to go and get services, public services, from our government because our government has enough money to be able to fund public services. A second key issue at the heart of the discussion, it's not only power contestation, but it's the role of the state. Because by taxing, you're saying our world is not going to be driven by neoliberal capitalism and individuals charting a world in which they want for themselves. At the center of development must be a strong state, public services, governments driving industrial policy, driving public services, not only redistributing, but making sure that industrial policy allows the entire country to grow for the benefit of everybody.
Thanks, Tanya. Zimbali, Tanya touched now on the questions of how inequality thwarts growth, how also it's a question of power, but I want to zoom into that last aspect that she mentioned, which was the provision of public services and the capabilities of the state, or the capacity of the state to provide services, but also an active policy. And of course, a big question of that is the fiscal space that the government has. I mean, we heard this morning several comrades referencing the austerity budget that has been presented. Do you think that taxing the super rich or the high net worth individuals, as we sometimes call them, could be an opportunity in South Africa to address this question of fiscal space and move away from austerity?
Thanks. Yeah, I think picking up from Comrade Tanya, we do know that taxing the rich will help us in terms of closing the gaps that we are facing. And the question is there political will to push forward on that front? And from like the people we see in the room today, it's quite indicative of where we are in terms of finding each other with the government. But yeah, there are opportunities, and the illustration by Prof. Zakman earlier shows that. And if I can just contextualize it, in South Africa we have 6 billionaire, US dollar billionaire, and these 6 men collectively are worth about 500 billion. That's about 10% of the GDP. And if we could just tax 2% of their wealth, we would bring about 11 billion, which, if you look at the proposed VAT hike, it was estimated to bring 13.5 billion per year, 0.5. And so if you just contextualize it in that sense, you see that it's a small drop in the ocean in terms of revenue potential that we need. And it needs to be supported by, like Comrade Sue said, not just taxing the net worth, but also going to corporations, increasing capital gains tax and inheritance taxes. And so alongside that, we also need the multi-coordinated industrial policy, as well as fiscal and monetary coordination, because at present we are seeing that our South African Reserve Bank is working in a manner that targets inflation and that strangles demand in the economy. At the same time, we have these austerity measures. So it's not only a question of the role of fiscal policy, but it's also trying to push back against what I forgot her name now, but she calls it the Trinity, the austerity Trinity, where it's not just it's fiscal policy, monetary policy, as well as a destruction of labor policies. And so I think those are some of the coordinated efforts that we need in closing fiscal space. It's not just a question of the tax issue, but how can other mechanisms be used to stimulate the economy. But yeah, those are just the insights for now that I have. Thanks.
Thank you. Anne, so Tanya in Zimbabwe would like to see tax reform here at the South African level to raise funds, but also to change the power balance when it comes to that. And Susanna earlier spoke about how we can have positive feedback mechanisms between the global and the national, building up the pressure for change. But of course, there can also be a sort of negative feedback in the sense that the international frameworks can limit what nation states can do, what reforms can be done at the national level. So if you look at the current international tax system, how does it limit the ability, especially of developing countries, and especially developing countries in Africa, to effectively have a tax of the wealthy? And how could we change that? So what reforms do you think would be needed to have a fairer global system that empowers especially the global south? And what role would you see for the UN in that?
Thank you very much for the question and for the opportunity to answer the question. Yeah, so like it was already mentioned by the speakers here and also earlier during the morning, the international tax system as it is, it's rigged for the rich nations. So it's based on what was referred to as residence taxation. So wealth is not taxed where it's actually generated. So you find wealth generated from our countries is not taxed here, so, and it may escape taxation. That's why you find billionaires and these big companies, they have low effective tax rates. So that's one of the challenges. And the other thing is, to make it worse, we sign into tax treaties that give away even more taxing rights. So the tax treaties we have, especially for developing countries, they have limited source taxation rights. By this I mean they are based on physical presence, which can be avoided by multinationals, especially when you're dealing with digital businesses. And the other thing is we have limited withholding taxes, like it was already mentioned. Like for instance, South Center has done a study that shows imbalanced tax treaties for the global south. And like South Africa, for instance, it has low treaty scores for treaties with countries like Netherlands, Luxembourg, US, whereby you find for some income streams like interest rates, royalties, which are mainly paid to big companies abroad, they may go untaxed. Actually, the withholding tax rate is 0% for interest and royalties on those treaties I've mentioned. So some of these limit taxation of source income. And the other thing is also lack of comprehensive wealth taxes. So we have some form of taxation on capital gains, on interest and royalties, but you find it's not comprehensive. We don't have net wealth taxes. In Africa, it's only Algeria that has net wealth tax, though it's not performing very well, so it needs to be enhanced further. So these are some of our challenges. And also we lack information. Like, for instance, we don't have public registers. I think a starting point would be to have public registers, especially for wealth of our politicians, for instance, because we don't have information on where this wealth is. And the other thing is there's also no integration. Like, for instance, you find land registry, registry of businesses, tax departments, they are not integrated. So you may not know how much is held. And even the estimates we have from Forbes lists of billionaires, they mainly rely on publicly available information like stock, from stock markets. So they may not capture this wealth, which we may not be aware of because there's no proper registries. So those are some of the challenges. So what we can do is, first of all, ensure there's a comprehensive wealth taxation system that is balanced. We need to have a right mix of taxes depending on our political environment. And then also introducing net wealth taxes. So the UN has developed a UN handbook on wealth and solidarity taxes. And it's done by the Committee of Experts of the UN. We have the Subcommittee on Wealth Tax and Solidarity Taxes that have done a great job in generating the handbook for wealth and solidarity taxes, as well as there's a UN sample law on net wealth taxation for individuals. So this is a starting point, especially countries considering to introduce wealth taxes on net wealth. There is already a tool existing. And in the handbook, it's a practical guide mainly focusing to support developing countries. So it gives like the types of wealth taxes. Like I've mentioned, we have interest, withholding tax on interest, royalties, capital gains, inheritance, net wealth. And net wealth, they focus on not just the accumulated stock of wealth, but also you consider less the liabilities, which could include loans and all that. And having also things like exit taxes. Because the other thing with wealth taxation is capital flight, and also there's fear of discouraging foreign direct investment. So the Wealth Handbook tries to see how to address these things, especially through international coordination. And the guide is a good tool for developing countries to build and start from. So I think that's all I can share on that. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that. Zimbali, Anne just pointed out some of the limitations we have internationally, but also some of the openings or guides we can turn to. Now, if we go sort of one level closer to home and look at the regional level, do you see a potential there for, South Africa to work with other countries in the neighborhood to promote coordinated efforts to tax the wealthy more effectively and to avoid the capital flight that we see happening as well?
I think that's a very complex question and it's often the answer we get when we're saying tax wealth, that there will be capital flight, people will migrate and so on, which is a fair response, given that we are still developing international cooperation on this topic. And I think there is scope. In South Africa, the SARS, South African Revenue Services, has already established a tax unit that is called the South African High Net Wealth Tax Unit, which has already started picking up and collecting data on the ownership of assets domestically and in foreign lands. And the SARS commissioner indicated that there is severe lack of capacity in a department that could needs about 80 people. Only about 10 to 15 are currently doing the work. So it's true what Anne is saying. We need to develop our capacity, but we are already in this topic technically making strides and are seen in some cases as a model to follow in terms of just the work that the SARS is doing. But we need to marry that with some of the momentum we are seeing at the international level. Particularly the Africa group has led us well in terms of putting forward a united front and trying to marry that with the technical work that is being done on the ground. The unfortunate part is that South Africa is constantly being left behind or being asked to speak on the issue like it was raised earlier, but is not intervening in a manner that supports coordination. So I think the challenge for us is to bring in national treasury in line with the discussions that are happening at the regional level. And then we can begin to put pressure on the international level such that coordination is achieved. So yeah, those are some of the technical work that needs to be married with the regional efforts that are already ongoing. So I would say we are already moving forward on that front, but there's still more work that needs to be done.
Thanks. I want to come back to that question of how do we move the actors and how could we get the South African actors to play a stronger role, as we were discussing this morning as well. But before that, Anne, I would like to come back to you. Zimbali already started reflecting and picking up some of the points you had made on how international cooperation could help address some of the limits that we currently have to effective taxation. Would it be possible to have a wealth protocol within the UN Convention, for example, or what other possibilities would you see?
Okay, thanks for the question. Yes, it's possible to have a wealth protocol. So the Latin American group wanted to have a wealth protocol as one of the early protocols. Well, Africa wanted the protocol on illicit financial flows, so we didn't get that, but there's still room to have that in the future. So the expected work under the UN Framework Convention, it's expected to we have final texts in July according to the work program, and then for eventual presentation in September 2027. So thereafter, assuming and hoping that the work will be completed, countries should be ready to ratify the UN Framework Convention as soon as possible. So we encourage countries to even start forming coalitions so that they can sign the UN Convention as well as the two protocols, which we hope can be finalized by 2027. Then thereafter, we can now focus on other important issues, including wealth protocol, illicit financial flows, and among others. And like it was pointed out in the morning, it's important to have a buy-in from as many countries as we can get. So African countries, I think we're doing a good job in leading the conversation at the UN negotiations, but also working together with other global south countries like Latin America, Asian countries, even other European countries and that are open to where we have similar priorities. We should work together so that we have the win. So it's possible, and also countries, we encourage many countries to implement wealth taxation. So the more we have countries implementing unilateral measures, it will also be easier to have international coordination, which is important. And with international coordination, we can be able to deal with things like the capital flight, because all countries will be having those taxations, so there's no incentive to shift profits or even to do tax competition. And also it may increase sharing of information, especially on offshore wealth. whereby you have a lot of offshore wealth, which countries may not be aware about. So if we have international coordination, it's likely also to increase transparency. So at the same time, we can be able to fight illicit financial flows, as we do international coordination of wealth taxation, and also discourage things like golden visas or visas based on your wealth, because also that encourages capital flight, whereby we have a number of countries that encourage golden visas depending on your investment. So international coordination could eliminate all that and deal with the problems of IFFs and also wealth taxation all at the same time with that coordination and unity among countries. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that. Susanna, Anne just said unilateral measures can influence what's happening at the international level. How does that work? What are the practical effects of domestic tax policies and revenue mobilization on the global agenda?
So taxation of wealth can happen can start at domestic level. We have a number of examples. I was speaking about Spain. In those almost 15 countries, we've increased the number of taxpayers and the revenue collection. But we have other countries like Colombia, who's implemented also, who's reformed the taxation of the net wealth tax very recently. But Colombia is also a good example on how this contradiction between creating the capacities and moving into the policy reform can explain that one without the other is not enough. So when at the time of the Panama Papers, for example, Colombia managed to implement to pass a mechanism to positively to encourage those who were on the Panama Papers to self-declare their wealth instead of going to sanctions. Because Colombia was already implementing a net wealth tax, they managed to increase the revenue collection by 800. So you can go into positive capacities in the country, but if there is no policy reform, it's impossible to take the opportunity, to seize the opportunity to really improve the collection. So I think the example of South Africa that Masani was talking about, I mean, how you can start working on the data even before having the net wealth tax implemented is a good example. But it's very unique that countries go into real conditions and capacities without having the attractiveness of moving into this direction because they want to make more effective their legislation. So I would say that it's very often like chicken and egg discussion, and that we are hearing very often that without the capacity element and without the technical conditions, the revenue collection or the effectiveness of taxing wealth is insufficient. But we need to start at some point, and when we have a legislation, this automatically is going to give the mandate to put enough resources for revenue authorities to build the capacity, because the capacities are not something that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. There are lots of examples. The other thing I wanted to say is in complement to what Anne was saying, that there is also a good moment now with the financing for the development international conference in Sevilla in Spain in next month. If we want to build this direction into the UN protocol or improving taxation of the super rich at the UN Tax Convention, let's start by making sure that this Financing for Development conference is well profiling the commitment to build a better or more sustainable development based on taxing the super rich, and also making sure that we have a coalition of the willing countries that in Sevilla are saying we want to stand and say and tax the super rich as part of the direction we want to build. So don't wait for everything to be sorted, to be fixed. Start by using Sevilla as a way to move and to stand up and say this is what we want to do.
Okay, Tanya, so Susanna is saying don't wait for everything to be in place. Stop arguing about whether you start with the chicken or the egg. Just get going. But if we look, and as we move into this afternoon also in our discussion about what is our strategy, how do we go forward, one common theme in this panel, but also before, was, well, it's all nice to have the technical details. We need the political will, and we need people to actually, put this into action. So what are the obstacles at the moment? What are the challenges politically in South Africa to taxing the super rich, and how can we shift that? And particularly as our union representative on this panel, what role do you think unions can play in changing that momentum and overcoming the resistance we have from the current elites and shift the narrative around taxation?
So I agree totally with you that we have to engage at all levels, and that this is a call to arms. The struggle is now, not waiting for perfect conditions. We'll never have perfect conditions. But what can workers do? Well, workers feel inequality every day of their lives. You'll go to work, you might walk to work. Many workers in South Africa walk to work, and the boss drives in a Mercedes, right? You work in a hot factory, or if you're an agricultural worker on the farm in the heat, the boss sits in a lovely air-conditioned office, drives an air-conditioned car. We know what inequality is. What amazes me is why there isn't more outrage around inequality. So even in our discussion now, we're saying, well, let's tax the super rich. The unit in SARS to deal with the super rich defines super rich as having 75 million rand in assets, right? Now in this country, 75 million rand of assets, if you had to take what a median worker earns, 20,000 rand a month, right? It would take, in fact, 300 years for a worker, if they weren't spending a cent on anything, to get to 75 million. And we think it's okay to say, well, don't worry, you've got 50 million, you're fine. You've got 40 million, you're fine. So I think we need to address the issue of inequality and what it means in our lives more. We do it in collective bargaining. In South African law, there's increased obligation to say how much the richest earn and how much the poorest earn. So the struggle starts on the shop floor. But of course, as unions, we don't just engage in the workplace, we engage more broadly. And for workers, more broadly means organizing in multinational companies so that I can't say as a capitalist, oh, you workers, no, I'm moving out of your country, I'm moving there. Workers there are much, much easier to work with. We need to make sure that there's solidarity among workers in multinationals so that we put a stop to bosses country hopping to try and find the most docile labor that they can find, to pay the minimum wages that they can find. Of course, we then need to be engaging our government on our budget, but also at international level. How do we do that? Well, workers around the world are a large number, and we have power by virtue of being in a workplace. But what makes us even stronger is when we engage in action, in dialogue with other progressive formations. We are a force that is unstoppable, and we need to believe in ourselves and take the fight forward. Not saying 75 million, ultra wealthy, that's where we start. Let's improve our lives now. Let's challenge the injustices now. And let's make sure that those people who are living off our labor, our sweat, our blood, in some cases our deaths, pay back. They must pay back, and we must ensure that they do.
Thank you. That's a good, almost a good intro into the next session where we're going to talk about action. But first, before we do that, I do want to open it to questions from the floor, also reflections on what needs to be done. But while you think about your contributions, I'm just going to throw in a bonus question, which any of you can answer, but we'll take the questions from there and you can join it as well. Tax justice is always also a question of gender justice. And I don't think we've had a lot of discussion on that today, so I'd like to pick that question up as well. So when we get into it later, any one of you who would like to comment on how yeah, increasing tax justice, and particularly with wealth tax as well, could be a contribution to gender justice. I'd be grateful there as well. I already see Tanya taking notes. That's good. But I want to give you the opportunity as well for questions, comments, ideas on how to move forward. Yes, I recognize you. Does anyone have the microphone? Okay. Can we start over there, then here, and then over there?
Okay.
Please, sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. As always, fantastic discussion. I mean, it's a favorite topic to be able to tax the net worth of the ultra-rich. So I am aware that the United Nations already has a template law on how to tax the net wealth of the rich. I'm thinking that that would be a good model to start off with, to start building on it. But I think the bigger conversation is around the global asset registry. How do we get to design that? What are the bottlenecks that we're going to face in trying to get this global asset registry, especially in line with data protection laws across many countries? So I just wanted to have your opinion on that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. Could we have the next question or comment from the lady in the orange blazer?
Yeah, I'm Hilda. I work with Siatini. I would want to know, when you look at the model Professor was proposing, he noted that at least we tax high net worth individuals who have wealth of about $100 million. What triggers my mind, at what point does a high net worth individual pay less tax than he's supposed to pay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like at that point. Then the other issue is on data. Like, to what it's related to her question on how we're going to beat the laws on data protection globally.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Then could you pass the mic just forward to Daryl here? Thanks.
Thank you. Mine is really just a comment. To underscore all of this, one, of course, we can't overestimate the importance of having a capable state. And I'll give you just a practical example that involves myself. I have a family trust. It holds assets. I must register at the revenue services for tax. But I cannot register at the revenue services because I need a letter from the master of the High Court. And I kid you not, it's taken me 7 years, and I still do not have that letter. Because we do not, so the revenue services do not know what my assets are. That's just to underline the importance of having a capable state if we want all of this to work.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There was one more hand at the table in the middle. Yes, please, Jen. The gentleman with the red tie.
Thank you very much. I am Bilo Cele from the South African Youth Association of Global Affairs. Thank you for inviting us. On the question of addressing inequality, I think there's something that is a concern. I don't know if I missed it or it wasn't discussed, but the fact that, for example, in the South African context, the labor market contributes over 74% of overall income inequality in the country. And I know that the importance of taxing the super rich. However, what about the disparities that are happening in the labor markets, which is the highest contributor in terms of income inequality in this country? Because then that speaks to the things that the basic people have to they have to be able to afford. So, for example, we know that the average worker in South Africa spends more than 50%, of their income just on transport. So that speaks also to state capacity in terms of affordable transportation, but it also speaks to I think the broader policy framework in relation to quality of education that people have, the low wages, within the labor markets. So I just want to ask from anyone from the panel, what are the policy recommendations to address this labor markets, which produces and continues to reproduce so much income inequality in the country? Thank you.
Thank you. Then next I have Sarah in the blue dress over there.
Thank you very much, Sarah Ganter from FAS Berlin. Thank you very much for this very interesting panel. I just have a very small question to colleagues from South Africa that links this debate to the strategy session afterwards. And my question is whether there are any possible voices from the rich that could rally behind better taxation of wealth, because in Germany we have Tax Me Now as an initiative of rich people, then there's patriotic millionaires in other places. So yeah, that's my question. Are there any rich people that we could get on board? Thank you.
Thanks. Sorry, Comrade Zico at the end there first. I'm going to take 3 more questions. I'm taking notes as well, but just in the interest of time, I'm going to let you answer them. Take your pick at all of them.
Thank you, Comrade Chair. I'm interested on the Brazilian case study. When they implemented the measures on this taxation, what was the response of the capitalist class? And was the process simply technical at governmental level, or there was also push from below by trade unions and broader civil society? Lastly, we have been talking here of also a regional strategy and continental strategy. Is there such strategy in Latin America? Are there countries that are also moving in a similar direction as Brazil? Is there cooperation among such countries, or at least civil society in Latin America? Thank you.
Thank you for that. Let's have Isabel over there, and then Jaco, and then we'll close and come back to our panel.
Good afternoon, Isabel from Oxfam, and sorry for being late. Thank you very much to all, but also to this panel in particular. I think, Tanya, my question to you. So many times engaging with the SARS commissioner, he speaks over calls for a wealth tax and says in a sort of very patronizing tone that we don't need a wealth tax, we just need to collect the taxes that are due. Why do you think the debate for a wealth tax in South Africa keeps on falling on deaf ears? It's a bit like Comrade Zico's question. And what levers do you think we should seek to activate to get a united front on it? Thank you.
Thank you. Then the final question we have from Jaco over here, and then I'll give it back to my panel.
Thanks. So, yeah, my one question point is related to Isabel. We definitely get the sense from what SARS and to some extent Treasury have been kind of saying or responding to this, that they're fully convinced that the wealthy are overtaxed to some extent. There was a paper that came out last year, co-authored by the current head of tax policy at Treasury, which looked at when the top tax rate was raised in 2016, where the kind of conclusion of it was that, like, we've reached the limit. Raising the tax rate actually didn't really result in revenues because people started avoiding it because the rate's too high, the whole Laffer curve thing. So I guess, yeah, maybe, I don't know, a question for the panel, I guess, should we, I mean, maybe it's just one thing to think about is in terms of focusing our research, focusing our energies on just really identifying kind of where the technical arguments are that has convinced people who might otherwise be sympathetic or open to a wealth tax. And trying to direct our research and so on to challenge that. Also trying to reframe the discussion. For example, like, is it really about being overtaxed, or is it really about the revenue service, the administration, not being able to catch people who then try and evade taxes? Yeah, but just, I don't know, it's not really a question, but just putting that on the table if no one wants to respond to that. And then, sorry, very quick one, is maybe a question for Anne or Suzanne, but where do you think that this proposal for like a coordinated action on billionaires or centimillionaires should be located? Leila suggested that it's something that can be done through developing the UN kind of template law on it. But what do you think would be the best kind of platform for having these discussions outside of the G20, beyond the G20, for more kind of global buy-in?
Okay, thanks for those rich questions and comments. I would suggest that we move from the international to the South African level. So we had a couple of questions around the international level where this should be located at the international level, the debate around the billionaire tax, but also the question of the possibilities for a global asset registry and how we move forward with that, but also at what point do the ultra-rich actually stop paying taxes, amongst others. But feel free to take a pop at any of the other questions that were thrown our way, and an extra biscuit for anyone who answers my question on gender justice in the tea break. So Anne, maybe do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your questions. Starting with Leila's question on global asset registers. Yeah, so it's important to have such a register. And I see this can be addressed through the international coordination. Like for instance, under the UN framework, under the Wealth Protocol, so it can come up with ways of having a global asset register, not just at the corporate level, even at the individual level, so where we have even billionaires declaring their wealth that is available publicly, even for all countries to see. Because what you find is that the wealth may not be accumulated like in developing countries, it may be in tax havens. So having that access to a global register will help developing countries to administer these wealth taxes. And apart from that, the Brazilian presidency for the G20, it was successful in getting a commitment for G20 countries to see how to implement wealth taxation. So South Africa can take the mantle and actually go into drawing the roadmap of how to do this. Because countries have committed to do it, but now the actions are not, they haven't outlined how to go about it. So South Africa can take up that and come up with things like global register, what kind of laws should be there, how will assistance in exchange of information be done, even how do you even establish like a global body to maybe even administer these taxes. Because you find like the rich billionaires, they're just a few, and like some of the wealth may be generated like from a country like South Africa, may not be in South Africa. So you may need a global body to coordinate even after the taxes are collected, how they will be shared to the actual countries that have contributed into it. I think that also addresses the question Jaco asked on how the money can be coordinated. So it can be coordinated at that level and also at the UN level. So it depends on which where countries opt to address it. And then on the issue of like wealth taxation, because the rich control the decision making and also how tax laws and tax reforms are done. So the elite capture also makes it difficult to implement these taxes. That's why international coordination would help. And also with international coordination, we can have issues to relieve double taxation. Because you find one of the reasons that people say, one of the challenges or the reasons, rich people would give is that they're overpaying taxes. So, because maybe they pay withholding tax on interest, taxes on profits of their companies. So, there can be double tax relief measures that can be considered even when drafting the law. The UN sample law also provides for how to give double tax relief for where tax has been paid elsewhere. So I think that's what I can say for now. And also maybe one last point, wealth taxation can also help to redirect wealth to more productive uses. So instead of wealth being accumulated offshore somewhere, so if you tax it, you'll actually encourage it. encourage the rich people to invest in more productive uses. So it's a good thing to increase market efficiency and even to generate more jobs for people. Yeah. So
Okay.
yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Susanna, I know you've been working with the comrades in Latin America, so maybe you could address that question about the regional strategy there, as well as what the reactions within Brazil were to these, to the proposal, but of course also feel free to speak to the questions of the international framework.
So first, there is already a number of countries in Latin America that have net wealth taxes. And even Argentina in COVID time, the previous government in Argentina was adopting the solidarity net wealth tax to collect revenues to be redirected to COVID mitigation programs. So there are examples of taxation of wealth insufficient in Latin America. But yesterday, Brazil was assuming the chair of the regional platform of taxation in Latin America. And one of the messages Brazil was passing when assuming this presidency is that they are bringing the legacy of the G20 to the regional work. So what we can be expecting is that we'll see how more countries in Latin America will be starting cooperating and bringing even building as an example how taxation of the super rich can become an agenda leading from the example of the coordination in Latin America. That has lots of challenges. One is also on this asset register. Can we imagine a regional asset register maybe? Can we think of something similar, a discussion that could be starting in Africa before we have a global asset? But in fact, what we need also to improve the beneficial owners register themselves and see how we can coordinate that to implement, to make them more efficient and start this cascade of transparency implementation. But there is also a strong movement in Latin America. I think there is more we could be winning from trying to create some bridges between the two regions to see how one can learn from the other, and also to be working hand by hand in the global negotiation. The reason for the creation of the platform in Latin America on taxation was also to have a stronger voice in the global discussion. So this global discussion would even be better if we have a number of different regions, like partnering with Africa to better defend those interests. And that I'm taking the question also of Jaco, that obviously the UN should be the place where the platform, where those discussions should be happening. Of course, this is where things should be happening, but it's going to, and it's already happening. Those discussions are already there. It's just what I was saying on the Financial for Development conference is don't wait until everything is fixed at the UN or on the UN tax convention. Start by passing the message. I mean, a coalition of the willing countries coming together in Sevilla is a very powerful message at the political level. But it's a way to create also a group of countries accelerating the path in exploring some of those discussions on the asset register, on what is the effective taxation that we could be thinking for the super rich, or who are the super rich. And just last point, when Isabel was saying that the comment from the head of SARS that we don't need to a wealth tax that just collected taxes. It's taxing the super rich is also a matter of building politics. I mean, trust in citizens. I mean, the acceptance of taxation needs to be strengthened. And when we see that the super rich in the different countries are not paying enough, then it creates also a lack of trust by citizens in contributing to taxation. So in countries especially where the lack of, when the tax avoidance is high or the informality in the market is high, then we need also to pass the message that if we are going to expand the tax base, we need to start by those who have more. And last point is that talking about the limit, in Spain, the taxation of net wealth starts at 1 million euros. There are more than 9 million people in Africa with a wealth above 1 million. So it is also a matter. It's 10 times more, almost 8 times more than in Latin America. So I think maybe the wealth concentration of this population is not as big in total combined as in Latin America, but the number of people and the relationship also with the rest of the continent is very big. So it is also a matter for the African continent. And we can then, again, we can build from the example of Latin America and how this has become a political message and the importance of building on reducing inequality to better invest in social policies, and Tanya was talking about that. So don't think this is something that only matters for Latin America or a discussion in Europe. It's also something that the African continent should be taking as a priority, and the G20 South Africa should be a moment also to pass that message.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Tanya, why does the debate about taxing the rich keep falling on deaf ears? Because it's also not a new one here in South Africa.
No. So it's elite capture, to use the term Anne just said, exactly, and vested interests. Why are you going to give up anything if you're not forced to give it up? I'll give, and it's this eye-opening story. A very good friend of mine, who I went to university with, to the surprise of all of us, including him, is now one of the ultra wealthy. Wow. So I'm sitting with him and I'm saying the other day, where do you think we're going with the US and what's happening? He says, I don't really care. He says, it makes no difference. The world economy could dive. I will still have more money than I even know how to spend, right? That's the difference. The ultra wealthy see themselves above everything because they've got enough money to do whatever they like, and they don't care about the rest of the world. We have to make them become accountable to us. They're not going to care on an emotional level, but they have to realize that unless they do something and start ploughing huge amounts back into governments, they are not going to be safe. How do you think revolutions start? What do you think happens? Right? They're not. They have to realize that. So how do we take it up? SARS is dragging its feet along. I mean, I don't know how they can say that there's a wealth tax when what you pay on transferring your house from 3 million rand is the same percentage as what a person selling a house for 80 million rand is going to pay. Because I can guarantee you that the person selling the house for 3 million rand, the vast 90% of their assets, 95% of their assets are in the house. A person selling a house for 80 million rand, it's going to be a small portion. So in fact, it's not progressive taxation, and it's not taxing the wealthy. What do we do about it? I think we need to strengthen the campaigns which already are going in South Africa and have resonance among people. So when we say there's an anti-austerity campaign, part of what we say when we say we don't want an anti-austerity budget is we say there are lots of other ways to get more money. One of them is a wealth tax, and we need to raise that in our anti-austerity campaign. But another huge campaign that workers feel very strongly about is the anti-privatization campaign. We are fighting for a government that employs people, that serves people. That's linked. You can't have a strong state if the state doesn't have money. We must link that back to ensuring that the state has money to deliver public infrastructure and public services. Let's link into what we're already doing. We engage on the budget. We keep pushing there. We have made some gains. We have an austerity budget. Do we like it? No. Did we manage to stop the increase in VAT? Yes. Was there a real increase in social grants, except for the SRD, 9% increase above inflation? Is it enough? No, of course it's not enough. Did we win? Did we get a win there? Increase? Of course we did. We need to build on that momentum to move forward. But what we also need to build on, is collective bargaining. Because the stronger we are as workers in workplaces, in government and in private companies, the stronger labour is as a whole. We need to organise, we need to negotiate, we need to fight for members' rights. Those, for me, are the key levers that we need to keep working on. May I answer one thing on labour markets? Because you correctly said labour markets are a key site that reproduces inequality. We need to think, where did that start? Essentially, when the South African economy started growing rapidly, it was off mining, it was off agriculture to serve the mines. What happened? We had large monopolies, we were exporting our minerals, we got the big companies growing very wealthy, and it was done precisely on low, ultra-low wages of labour in South Africa. That legacy is still with us today. Was women's work ever recognised or paid in terms of gender? No. Is care work paid of women now? No. That's where we need to be extending our fight for. Making sure that we're bargaining and getting better wages. Making sure that we've got an industrial policy that grows the sectors that afford decent jobs for all of us. We can't let financialisation run wild here, and these super rich invest their money into building more warehouses and shopping malls when we're not producing things in the economy. That's crazy. We must tie their money in. We must build our economy. And the national minimum wage. We can't say we're addressing inequality in the labour market unless we enforce and implement the national minimum wage and make sure that it increases above inflation year on year. Thank you.
Thanks. Finally, Zimbali, do I need to feel sorry for the overtaxed wealthy of South Africa? And are there any that potentially could join this fight for taxation amongst the rich in South Africa?
The answer is no. You don't need to. For
On
reasons.
both counts.
Yeah. But I think Tanya's friend needs to be in the room. Tanya's just volunteered her ultra-millionaire friend. So I don't know any millionaires, unfortunately. But I think, I want to go to the question of gender. I think we are facing some policy hurdles where government is working in silos. We have a gender-responsive budgeting framework, which of course has some limitations. TD can attest to this through the work we've done in the working group in the BJC. And that framework does not see revenue or revenue-raising measures as one of the ways to tackle gender inequality. And so, together with fiscal policy and a context of austerity measures, we are then not seeing the coordination in terms of the Department of Women putting forward a very strong gender-responsive and intersectional framework. And so that means we often see those two issues as disconnected from each other, whereby it's just about gender empowerment as opposed to putting progressive tax measures that at the center of them seek to tackle gender inequality. And so hence we're seeing public services being undercut. And like Tanya said, that has gendered implications because it means women's time is limited in order to participate in the labor market, but it also means the care work increases and basically subsidizing the public sector. And so I think that's the challenge we face, and it also goes back to the question of labor market policies. Our fiscal policy does not see job creation as a target. You know, we're focusing on debt stabilization as opposed to seeing job creation as one of the real targets to drive a structural transformation. And one of the proposals we've put forward is to use developmental financial institutions as one of the ways to drive structural transformation in the economy, because as it stands, DFIs are incapacitated in terms of their balance sheet. as well as the cost of borrowing in the market. So we need the South African Reserve Bank, to play a role in ensuring that DFIs are capitalized and they can actually drive structural transformation by investing in key sectors of the economy, including manufacturing, including construction. And I think Tanya put it better than I would have, but I just wanted to add that point as a parting remark. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know we haven't come close to exhausting this discussion, but we have exhausted our time, unfortunately. I've really enjoyed this conversation with the four of you. I think they deserve a round of applause for this discussion. Thank you so much. We will have a short tea break. Can I please see everyone back in the room at 3:40?